Hello everyone, my name's Adam Blocker. I'm a longtime member of the iRacing IndyCar community and a real-life motorsport engineer. And today I wanted to talk through the hybrid system on the Dallara 18 in iRacing. Just talking through the basics of how it works and the options that you can adjust on it. So I have a replay pulled up of Barber Motorsports part, and just to help kind of go through how it works. So, but before I start playing it, I just want to talk through some things. So, first of all, the hybrid on the IndyCar is basically an electric motor that is in series with the engine, that's tied to the rear axle. When you deploy energy on it, all of the power will go through the rear wheels, just like the engine power is. It'll add to the engine power, and then when you regen energy, it's basically adding rear brake to the car because it's adding additional braking torque to the rear wheels. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to like the original F1 KERS system, if anyone is familiar with that. It's pretty low power output. It's about, let's say, half to 2/3 of the power output of push to pass on the IndyCar. So the power output is not that significant. Then the energy store of the supercapacitors, or in layman's terms, a lot of people call it the battery. In iRacing, or a lot of other people, or basically in general, a lot of people will refer to that as SOC, state of charge, which is basically just a way to say how much energy you have in battery percentage. The energy store of the car is very low, so you'll see that over this lap of Barber Motorsports Park, I'm going to go through the whole battery from 100 to 0 to 100 to 0 multiple times within the same lap. This isn't like one of the GTPs or an F1 car where your charge will last for multiple laps without needing to regen significantly. So that's one way that makes the system unique. In the car, we have a few different things. So these lights on the side of the cockpit are a quick indicator for how much state of charge you have. So you can see entering turn 1 at Barber, when I lifted, which is another thing to note, the regen on iRacing is set up to be throttle based. So that means that it's independent of whether you're braking or not. When you lift fully off the throttle, you'll have max regen, and then there is an amount of regen, so battery recharge, below 25% throttle. So if you're at 15% throttle, it will do an amount of regeneration. Keep in mind, on a road course, that distinction hardly ever matters, because most of the time when you are doing a full lift, you are braking. So I'll show T5 for example, but you can see that the second I lift the throttle, these lights start increasing, which shows that I've increased energy. And the same thing when I go into turn 2, 3. And then on exit, I deploy hybrid and push to pass, which are two separate things. Push to pass is just the normal IndyCar extra engine boost, separate from the hybrid, that you get a certain amount of seconds for every race. See that I deployed it partially, and then once I lift and start braking for the next brake zone, it regens. And then again I deploy on the next straight. So, and then the other thing to note here is there's this bar, which I'll fast forward a little bit. As I go through the lap and I'm deploying energy, this bar fills up. What this bar is there is a limit of deployment energy that you can, or energy that you can deploy every lap. So essentially, when you hit this on a given lap, you will not be able to deploy anymore. Once I hit start finish, that resets. So that's independent of how much energy you have. If your deployment stops early and that bar is filled up, it's because you legally cannot deploy anymore. In the black box at the bottom, if you scroll through the relative and everything, then you can see your state of charge and lap, how much percent deploy you have left on the lap, both displayed in an actual number. But at least normally for me, when I'm in the car, I just look at these lights and this bar. One thing to note that's minor is that you do get a little bit more deployment after this last light is out. The last light goes out with still 15 or so percent state of charge left. So I would hold, if you're trying to get a full deployment, just hold your deploy button down a little bit longer than the lights indicate. In terms of buttons that you need to map to your wheel, I would say that the main thing is you need minimum 2 buttons. So you need a button that you hold down for deploy. It's mapped to be a push and hold button, which in general is not that inconvenient because the deployments last only a few seconds, as you can see, coming off the last corner here. It lasts for half the straight. Then you need to map a manual regen button. So I discussed already that there is off throttle regen every time you lift the throttle, but there's also manual regen where you can push a button and at any point, even when you're full throttle, you can regen energy. Let me see. So you can see in the hybrid system part and keybinds and settings, the HYS boost hold is your deploy button, and HYS regen hold is that manual regen button. And then you can adjust your regen gain and deploy setting, which I'll talk about in a minute. The manual regen is not that important on road courses, except in there's some scenarios which I can discuss in a minute once I start to get more into the strategy of using it. But its main intention is on ovals, on big ovals where you're not lifting very much, so you naturally will not be regenning a lot of energy. Particularly if you're like leading on a 1.5 mile plus oval. The idea is that you can then regen at full throttle and then use that energy however you want to race people. I would say in general the hybrid usage is significantly different in terms of how it applies to the racing on a road course versus an oval. In practicality, on a road course, you're most likely going to be doing almost the same strategy every lap because the supercapacitor and the battery quote-unquote charge is so small that essentially you're just going to be replicating the same thing every lap. There's some tracks where you could do slightly different variations every lap, which I can give an example at Barber. And then, but on ovals, except for short ovals, like let's say like Milwaukee or Richmond or something, and on those you'll probably do a very similar strategy every lap. But like the big ovals, like let's say the Indy 500 or like a Michigan, Fontana, anything like that, you're gonna be deploying and regenning completely based on your traffic situation, what the style of racing is, and it's a completely different dynamic situation. While the road courses, like I said, like you're doing the same thing over and over again for lap time in general. All right, we'll start to get into the performance side of things. One thing that's huge to note is that the IndyCar does not have brake bias control with relation to the hybrid regenning. So, what that means is, if you are at 100% state of charge, so that all the lights are full and you have your essentially your supercapacitor is full, what that means is that you'll not be able to regen any more energy because you're at 100% already. So at that point, when you're not regenerating anything, your brake bias, which brake bias is the proportion of braking energy going to the braking power going to the front tires versus the rear tires. So the more forward the bias, the bigger number, which is this number on the dash here, 54.9. The bigger number, it means you will get more front locking. The smaller the number, you'll get more rear locking. When the hybrid is at full charge, you will have less rear braking because the hybrid is not trying to add additional braking torque to the rear axle. So, and vice versa. When you are regenning with the hybrid, it is effectively acting like more rear brake. So ideally, if you had a variable brake bias system, the brake bias would shift by over 2%, just to give you an idea. Obviously, it depends on the exact braking zone. One thing to note is that on iRacing, with how it's set up, the regen is a flat value when you're completely, because it's in relation to being off throttle, right? So let's say that you are regenning with 35 newton meters of regen torque. If your braking torque is 300 newton meters of front brake and 250 newton meters of rear brake, when you add the 30 newton meters of extra braking torque on the rear, then you have a small bias shift there. But as you bleed off the brakes, your brake torque from the physical brakes reduces. So let's say it goes down to 60 front and 50 rear. Your hybrid regen torque is going to stay the same. It is going to stay at 35 newton meters as long as you are off throttle and still have not hit 100% SOC. So in that case, that 35 newton meters becomes a bigger percentage, a bigger impact as you get off the brakes. And then, of course, the regen is still active if you have a coast phase. So if you haven't reached 100% charge. So if you once you're off brake completely, the hybrid's still active like here, I'm off brake. I've cleared the brake, and I still I pretty much cleared the brake, but I still have energy regenning. There's no off brake there. Oh, this will be an off brake. But basically that means that in terms of a balance effect in practicality, the biggest impact that you will feel from the hybrid on iRacing, especially because we have about 30%, maybe 20% of the adjustability that they do in real life. In real life, there's a lot more options to how to fine tune this thing and make the balance really good. But basically, what you will feel, what you can feel is that when you release brake, when you're trail braking, it can feel like you're like locking rears or pulling a handbrake, and vice versa. When you get to 100% state of charge, and you're not regenning anymore, and the car is set up to have that rear brake at the end, you can easily lock the inside front and feel like you have understeer. So one of the reasons why it's important to replicate the same hybrid deployment strategy every lap is so that your balance doesn't shift. Now is probably a good time to talk about the regen gain. So one of the two ways to affect car balance and adjust the effects of the hybrid is the regen gain. I would say that this is particularly important on road courses. So what the regen gain does, which it'll be a number between 5 and 10 on the dash, or in the black box it displays a 0.5 to 1.0. 1.0 corresponds to 10, 0.5 corresponds to 5. Essentially, 10 is maximum off-throttle regen. 5 is 50% off-throttle regen, and then all the settings in between. 7 is 70%. Okay. Basically, yeah. So it adjusts your off-throttle regen torque. This regen gain does not affect the manual regen where you push a button and hold it to regen. Just while I'm thinking about it, in real life, above a certain speed, the clutch paddles turn into the hybrid regen, and they pull a paddle to do the manual regen. But in iRacing, most people are probably going to end up mapping into a button on their wheel. Okay, but so that the manual button push is always 100% regen. That's not affected by this setting. The off-throttle regen setting between 5 and 10. Basically, here's the pros and cons of each. If you set it at 5 everywhere, the benefit will be the balance shift from having regen and no regen is much smaller. So essentially, it's more friendly to drive, but the downside is that because you're regenning less, you will have less energy to deploy with. At Barber, as an example, this is a track where you cannot get away with a small regen number because you have two longish straights back to back. So just to back up like half a step, the most optimal places to deploy the hybrid on a road course, or in general out of principle, is going to be deploying it at the beginning of every long straight after you have reached the phase where you're not limited by wheel spin. You can just go easy full throttle. So you can see, like, once I get kind of pointed straight, I'm deploying. And then I just know how much I can deploy at every corner to not hit the lap limit of 100%. But you can see here that I just get to 100% charge before this is another decently long straight by barber standards. And one thing to note is that typically if you're using push to pass for lap time gains, not for racing someone, the places you're going to be deploying hybrid are generally also going to be the most effective places to use push to pass, is one way to think about it. But in general, it's always, low gears at the beginning of a long straight to give you that extra boost of speed that you will carry down the whole straight. Right? Or, similar on an oval, it's typically going to be corner exit, except in very specific racing situations. For this next corner sequence, if I was running a lower regen gain, I would be completely fine because I hit 100% charge well before. I still have more off throttle time that I'm quote unquote wasting because I'm not regenning. So, I could have probably run a gain of 7 or 8 for this corner, but around the lap I'm limited by this corner's amount, so I end up running 10 because I need to for that corner and then this corner, where essentially if I run anything less than probably a 9 or 10, I'm not going to get full energy on the next straight. There's other tracks where there's bigger gaps between the straights where you can end up running a regen gain of 7 or 8, let's say, and still get the same deployment onto the straights, but then it's just nicer for car balance where you're not having all that rear brake on late entry. And one thing is the regen gain. I would say the settings on the car that's most interactive with are the diff. So diff preload or the coast ramp on the diff or the friction faces. I would say the more regen gain you're running, so the closer to 10 you are, the more locked you need to have your diff. And I cover how the diff works in another one of my videos about drivetrain related items, so I would recommend watching that if you want to learn more about diff stuff. So we talked a little bit about regen gain, and you can just see that in terms of deployment, I'm using it at the beginning of every long straight, just as I said. After I'm this is an example where I don't use it in first because it's possible to get wheel spin in first with the first gear I had and the grip I had at the time. So I wait until I get where I'm power limited and I use it. There's another setting, it's called the deploy setting. So in this case I have it at 8. Basically the deploy setting controls how much torque is output when you deploy. So I think it's a setting between it starts at 10 and then it goes down. Essentially, if it is deploy of 10, that means that it is the maximum deployment torque, but it'll last for a shorter time because obviously you're going to go through the charge faster. The longer, or the lower the number, it means it'll deploy with less torque, but for longer. In general, I would say that if you're a high-level driver that's trying to optimize the last details, you can worry about this. But for 99% of people on the service, I would just leave the deploy number between 8 and 10. And that's what's going to be best. Because in the majority of situations, you just want to deploy as much energy as you can right off the corner initially. And so then that speed carries all the way down the straightaway. And the other thing is that that is better for racing situations where you need to get a good exit coming off the corner to get to the car in front of you to get their draft or or to defend from someone or whatever. It's just a more flexible strategy, and any lap time gains related to changing your deployment amount, your deployment gain, are on the order of 100th of a second. So I would say to only worry about your deploy gain once you get to the point where you're carrying about hundreds of a second, which is not the case for almost anyone on iRacing, except for like pro level drivers or people close to that level. The regen gain, on the other hand, is something that everyone that's building a setup should mess with, because it has a decent effect on car balance. And like I said, if you're really struggling with entry instability in that trail brake phase, especially in low and medium speed corners, I would recommend trying to go down on it. And there's some tracks, where I've run very low on it, because you can just get away with it and still get the maximum deployment every lap. There's other tracks like Barber, for example, where you can't do that without losing some deployment every straight. And the deployment every straight, like if you don't do any deployment versus doing deployment, is worth 2 to 3 tenths on most road courses. So losing, let's say, 20% of that deployment is probably half a tenth, which, as annoying as it is when you're going, like, half a tenth is half a tenth. Like, that's a decent amount of time. That's just free, in terms of, from a driving perspective, it's free. So, in general, I would say that that's the basics of the hybrid on iRacing. Let me know if you feel like I left anything out. Feel free to message me, any questions that you have on how it works, how to use it, any more, technical questions on anything, or just basic questions, anything. I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, thanks everyone for watching, and see y'all in the next video.